Okay, you're good to go.
All right, it's a really good turnout compared to last year. Who was here for this conference last year? It's getting bigger. That's pretty cool. All right, well, we're going to talk about healthcare emerging frameworks. But before I start, I want to tell you guys how I got into the healthcare side of the business. I'll tell you a little bit about myself after this, but this is really interesting because the very first time was just a boring assignment. Somebody got breached, and they're like, okay, we need security professionals. But the second assignment was really awesome. I can't name the hospital, but it's a pretty small hospital. It's a niche that provides plastic surgery and all kinds of stuff. But they work with superstars. So think like Hilton, Kardashians, and those kinds of folks, right? So somebody from the internal department has sold off records to outside in order to make some money. So that's kind of how I got in, and there's all sorts of photos at risk of being leaked for some of the stars that you see in Hollywood. And I'm like, man, I was a prior defense guy. I'll give you my background, but I'm like, hospitals are kind of more fun. You never know what you come across, right? So that's kind of my intro into how I got into healthcare security. It wasn't even about PHI. It wasn't even about risk. It was all about, we don't want naked pictures out there of somebody. So I'm like, all right, well, that's the field I need to go into, right? Once I got into it, my background has been in quite a bit in defense. I have a prior, I moved here from India for about 13 years ago, and I joined the U.S. military, and I started to learn everything I could about security. I joined as a security specialist. It's my job, so I'm like, hey, I'm gonna learn everything that I can. I deployed quite a bit, got all kinds of certifications and whatnot to get into this. And what I'm really into is taking complex organizations and making them simple. And GRC is one of those fields. So I'm passionate about what I do. I love reading regulations, the boring stuff, and automating it, right? So when I kind of got into the healthcare, I thought, okay, how does this, healthcare, me coming from a defense background, now I'm going into healthcare, and I got standards, operating procedures, a very good rhythm to stuff. How does that compare to, where I'm going? And, what I noticed is that healthcare is actually the most sensitive out of all of the different agencies that I work with the exception of defense, certain weapons platforms, because we have the most data, right? And it's unrecoverable, meaning once I give up my fingerprint, I can't change it, right? So, and the other thing is in defense and finance, we see the impact right away. If I lose money, I see it right away. But in healthcare, it's a long-term implementation of that data being lost. You really won't know the impact. Maybe 10 years from now, you'll realize, okay, somebody knows that I got HIV and now I can't get married, right? Something like that, right? It's a long-term implication, right? When we come to the infancy or maturity of entire healthcare, it's immature because you have a very unique environment, right? You might have SCADA equipment from other vendors. Like, of course, you got Epic, but there's lots of other machines, like X-ray machines. So the FDA is supposed to have oversight of those machines, and they're kind of late to the game in terms of regulating and increasing the level of security, right? So, generally, it's more, when we compare to finance or defense, it's immature. What we're seeing out there is more of a, there's going to be higher scrutiny in this area. In the next 2 to 3 years, I think the healthcare will totally transform. And it's going to be a chance for CIOs to shine, or in few hospitals, we've seen them replaced. Like my very first assignment, the CIO was completely replaced with a cybersecurity guy, or with somebody with a strong security background, right? So that's kind of what it is. It's a long-winded introduction to who I am, what I do. I love what I do. What you can expect from me on this presentation is GRC is a big buzzword, so you can expect a very clear, unambiguous presentation. You can ask me questions if you have any. You can be like, Max, I've heard this before, but you know it doesn't make sense. We'll talk about. The presentation is in a format of how you actually start, but at the same time, what are some of the things that are happening right now? Some of the emerging frameworks, right? So, you know, in my experience, healthcare is really tough. How many work at hospitals right now? How many work with, like, as a business associate, somebody doing business with a hospital? All right, almost everybody. So the main thing is in hospitals, it's really about determining how to take the best approach, because it's really hard compared to any other industry, in my opinion. How are you going to secure an X-ray machine? I mean, you got to work with the vendors, and they might say, well, we're immature, we don't have the funding, where's the guidelines, right? There's no authoritative kind of sources in healthcare when we compare it to other industries. Now, I know we got the HIPAA legislation, we'll talk about that, but when we compare it to defense or finance, it doesn't have that much teeth comparatively, right? So that makes it really challenging to make a business case to your senior leadership. And we'll kind of go over, you know, how do we do that, but before we move forward, why is it tough? Why is it difficult when we compare to other industries? There's obvious reasons, like, oh, well, the management doesn't care, or we're patient-centric, and the data doesn't really provide value compared to patient safety, right? So the management makes decisions based on other factors, right? So what we found is that the main root cause is really because security, generally we approach it from an upside-down kind of environment. I'm really passionate about what I do. I like to do software engineering. I like to do frameworks, and I'm a guy like three levels below the CIO, right? So we take a bottom-up approach, and that's fine because we're happy about it. We love what we do, but the reality is today business environments, all businesses are driven from the owners, the directors, down to the workers, right? And generally security is down here. So what we got to understand is all authority, whether it's security, business related, or legal, it comes from a higher kind of source, right? So you have to figure out, what is that higher source? Is this my board of directors? Is this my managers, right? And generally we try to shoot for at the board of director level, right? So that's kind of where some of these frameworks are being presented to, right? So, so in context of security, we've seen these. Have you guys seen that Alien show? And they're talking about we found pyramids all over the world. You guys seen that, right? Yeah. So, in security and in almost every single field, a lot of legislators, lawyers write these, there's always some sort of pyramid, right? Saying, okay, at the very top, you got some sort of strategy, you got something in the mind of the executive, and after that, it gets decomposed down to either business processes, risk management, then it gets down to the control level, right? So the reason why you want to start your GRC or any kind of emerging framework effort is because you'll get funding for it, right? And the basic definition that we use for governance is give me money and give me control with authority, right? So there's all sorts of other definitions out there, like processes and procedures and frameworks. None of those things are possible unless you have control and resources. So that's kind of what we try to illustrate, that every single framework has that, and we are lacking that in healthcare. So kind of where to start your journey. And again, this is more of where, how do you start the journey, but how do you leverage emerging frameworks into that? So imagine this continuum. on one side you have a completely insecure environment. You can call this whatever you want. It's not healthcare, it's just, let's just say it's a piece of laptop or a piece of data sitting here, anybody can come and pick it up, right? On the other side, you have a completely secure environment. It's really hard to make that environment completely secure. It's nearly impossible goal, right? So when a management asks us, it's like they usually want to be way over here. They're like, well, here's the money, just get me to a secure. It's a possibility, that's what they want, yes or no answer, right? So the way we explain most of these things to healthcare executives is that, you know, me living in India, it's pretty lawless. They have laws, but they don't enforce them. But in America, you know, you have laws for everything. OSHA, HIPAA, for whatever, right? That's the first level of kind of maturity. That's where most people kind of start. For us, it might be HIPAA security rule, right? But where organizations in the United States want to be, they kind of want to be, you know, what they call it ahead of the curve. Like, we don't want to go so far ahead that we're costing ourselves a lot of money, but we just want to be better than the law so we don't get fines and whatnot. And usually what's happening in cybersecurity is that there's an external force. And that force can be defined by breach, lawsuits, hackers, nation states, right? So we laid kind of this graph saying, okay, the external forces, you know, they're not requiring us to be 100% secure, but it's out there, right? We're actually ahead of the compliance curve, but we're really behind when it comes to an external force management, right? Breach and whatnot. So usually what we try to do is move the organization ahead of that. We don't say, hey, we want to take your program and make it secure and whatnot. And we kind of describe that the healthcare gap. That's the widest gap in our industry. For healthcare, it's a pretty wide gap when you compare the data set from other industries. We also call this red line inherent risk. You might have heard that term is like, okay, because you're a mouse, what kind of enemies do you have? You're gonna be harmed by a cat or something, right? So we also call those kinds of things inherent risk profile, and that's in financial industry. They use that term quite a bit under a framework called FFIC, right? So once we kind of have this narrative described to our management on where they are in terms of following the law, kind of the first step of maturity is just following the law, right? Usually, I understand that most of the people say, well, security doesn't equate to compliance, and I completely agree with that. However, in order for you to get to that side of the house, you've got to start here. That's just a level of maturity that's a lot of people are not understanding, is that we use laws, we use standards to push cybersecurity. If you do it the other way around, you'll end up with a completely immature environment. Meaning we'll spend money every time there's a breach. You'll look at trends. Oh, we need a new firewall, or we need access control. We need all these other things, right? And then the hackers will work around it. And the main finding has been is that we're not really using the frameworks properly. We're not establishing authority from the get-go, which is from top down, right? So kind of when I talk to a lot of people, and this I didn't know, some people don't even know what a law is, right? So I didn't know that either. So HIPAA, it's a law. I'll give you the first one. How many of you have heard of high tech? Is that a law? What do you guys think?
Yes.
Yes. That's a law. Yes, that's a law. All right. PCI. All right. PCI is a non-voluntary, or it's a voluntary role, right? So sometimes when we present like a PCI type framework, we present it to the executives like as if they have to do it. They really don't. And that's kind of when we lose them, because your legal compliance officer, whoever, may look at the Federal Register. He or she may say, well, I don't really see this in here, right? So they'll listen to you, but the message will not get transferred up to the top. Because the executives will be like, well, this is not a law, I don't really have to do it, right? I don't have to do that, right? We'll also talk about interpretation of law, when you are actually like, okay, well, HIPAA says this, that means we have to do it. Well, how do you actually decompose that further now? How do you actually say, all right, this means I have to change this computer setting, right? How do you kind of drill down all the way, right? How many of you have heard of high trust? Are you guys fan of high trust?
No.
No, I hate it too. I like it from a security practitioner standpoint as a consultant. I make a ton of money selling it, but reality is it's not a law, and it's overly burdened sometimes, right? It's got, what, 300 requirements or something?
Up to 500. It is painful to do an assessment with high trust.
500 requirements. Come on, that's just ridiculous, right? So, again, if you pass this to the management, at first they'll say yes, because usually the business case is established, oh, our vendor, or somebody who we're trying to do business with, they said do high trust. So if we do high trust, we're going to get a lot of business. What was that?
You get a fancy seal on your website.
You get a fancy seal, right? But they don't know the cost of that fancy seal, right? When they decompose all of those 500 requirements, turn them into tasks, and put hours next to them, it's like a $200,000 exercise, and you might be trying to go for a $50,000 customer, right? So a lot of times people communicate that as a law. How about NIST risk management framework? Have you guys seen it, right? You guys heard of it, okay? All right, so that's not a law either. And then the Privacy Act of 1974, that's a law. All right. And then GLBA. Have you guys ever dealt with that?
It's now FFIEC.
Okay. So the shortcut way for me to immediately know when I see a bunch of acronyms, if it has an A at the end, that's an act, right? It's most likely a law. I mean, it's a good way to take a guess. High tech doesn't. But, you know, don't just trust high trust. Don't just trust PCI. You know, those are voluntary obligations, and your board wants to know. They want to know what is actually voluntary and what is non-voluntary. They want to know that in a very clear, communicative manner, right? So after we kind of establish that, eventually you'll get to the point where you'll have a nice spreadsheet with a matrix with all of your CFRs, and then you'll figure out how am I doing these CFRs, right? And you'll get to the point where a compliance officer will be satisfied, and a security practitioner is like, man, that's just paperwork exercise. We really ain't doing security, right? So what you're going to have to do is, instead of leveraging the framework at that time, you got to turn that conversation. You got to transition it to risk. That's what it comes down to next, right? It's first when you met the law, the next thing is the risk, right? HIPAA is like, how old is HIPAA? You know the age of it? 96, right? So it's really nothing new under the sun as far as the law goes. We got high tech, which kind of gave us more teeth. But the reality is, it's kind of been there. The legislative framework has been there since 96. When you go to your compliance manager, the compliance officer, they already know these things. They've been doing them a certain way, right? So instead of leveraging a framework at that time, turn the conversation into a risk, right? Because now that you've met in your world, you've met your bare minimum recommended actions, what's the risk of doing anything beyond that, right? So information security, when it comes to risk management, it's a whole new language. We've seen hundreds of different methods in this risk management framework. FAIR, Octave, right? These are good to learn, but when you go to your management, they don't really know. They're kind of used to like hearing patient safety, right? They're used to hearing like safety of patients, patient outcome, and those kinds of things. And somehow we have to get creative, but not really crazy on how to communicate those. Crazy as in we can't have, a fairy tale kind of, okay, so, I'll give you an example. Somebody broke into the wireless network to inject more of one medicine than required, something like that. Those kinds of things really happen. We've seen hacks at DEF CON and other places where people are demonstrating those. But when you're actually presenting that to management, it kind of sounds like fairy tales. It kind of sounds like, well, yeah, that's nice, but come on, this is not James Bond, right? So when we turn the conversation over to risk, try to leverage the internal language that they're already using, rather than giving them a new set of language, rather than teaching them things like FAIR or Octave. Those are all good things. I love those things, but I know that it's a communication problem, right? So that's kind of how we transition the dialogue in order to leverage something much mature. So I like to use this chart. When I first moved to the United States, one of the biggest problems I had was language. So English is my third language. So I'm from India, so all of those languages are on that side, and English is somewhere over here, right? So one of the biggest confusions was whenever somebody would say, "Do you see what I mean?" I didn't know if they meant body of water or if they meant vision. I literally had no idea. I've had a lot of embarrassing moments too. I asked my teacher is she having an affair, right? And what I was trying to see is how's your business going, or things like that, right? These are small things that a foreigner had no idea about, right? So I made all kinds of weird comments. I was a weird kid in school making weird comments because I just didn't understand, right? So I see information security a lot like that, right? We have a lot of language that we use to kind of mean the same thing, but we don't. We kind of don't have a good handle on that, right? So I put all the languages of the world, and they're all kind of related. Historically, scientifically, they say there used to be one language in the world. That's what that chart shows, right? It's done by some scientists. I don't know. But wouldn't it be nice if we did have a single language in cybersecurity, right? Everybody, when I said vulnerability, everybody understood what that actually meant, right? But that's like an unreasonable goal. That ain't going to happen. We've kind of tried that with a couple of frameworks. The government's tried that, come up with a single language. Industries tried that, and it doesn't work. So if you're using a framework to describe breach of contract, but your legal officer is using the terminology of business associate, when you get to court, what's going to rule out is whatever's in the Federal Register, right? So there's a lot of issues with GRC as a whole, right? So before you turn the conversation from compliance and then going into risk, before you go to frameworks, just be aware of this, right? These are the things that some of the U.S. government policymakers are addressing, right? So eventually, you want to transition into frameworks if you have buy-in, if you're like, all right, I've started my journey. I understand that it has to be clear and unambiguous language that everybody understands, right? It might be HIPAA for a hospital, for a retail, it might be PCI, whatever it is, right? You eventually say, okay, we want to become a mature organization. How do I transition to a framework, right? And what is it, right? It's generally, you can look at it as a document that a bunch of smart people come up with, and they believe these are the best practices. These are guidelines. That's generally what framework boils down to. And you can take things out, and you can put things back in, right? It's different than a legislative framework. A legislative framework, you may not be able to take things out. If you do, it requires a strong justification, right? If you say that this is an addressable control, it requires a really strong justification on why. Compared to ISO, you don't really have to have a justification, right? NIST CSF, cybersecurity framework, you don't have to have a justification, right? So there's a difference between a legislative framework and an industry framework, right? So when you do this, it'll increase the level of confusion drastically, because that's when you'll get into a lot of conversations about mappings. And, okay, so if we're using this framework and we got a PCI environment, we got a HIPAA environment, and there's the organization, and they have all these business units underneath them, how do we translate all that language and how do we coordinate that effort, right? So be aware of that. So before that, having clear understanding of the language, communicating that is really important. And the framework is just the beginning. It just tells you what to do. Sometimes it tells you how to do it. There's really not a lot of frameworks that tell you how to do something. They just tell you what to do, right? So I was contemplating if I should actually put this up, because I don't want to offend anybody, but I'm going to be honest. I think frameworks cause a lot of problem. If done incorrectly, there's a lot of money being wasted. I come into organizations, I implement a strategy, and we get lost inside of frameworks all the time because it's rehashing those same data over and over. Like an auditor comes in, he does a PCI audit, you give him your policies, and a different auditor comes in, he wants to do a HIPAA audit, and he wants a different set of policies. ISO auditor comes in, he wants a different set of policies, right? And, if we could figure out how to address this issue, we could reuse those funding, that type of funding, to actually fight cybersecurity issues, right? We could rededicate those resources to firewalls, block, tackle, respond, recovery, all those things that we're supposed to be doing. So one of my biggest complaints in industry is that we seem to be recreating this problem. In my opinion, it's just my opinion, not my company's opinion, the certification is nice, but it doesn't really achieve security. We've learned that from PCI, right? When Target happened, PCI was the first thing that said, PCI Council was the first one saying, we told you it doesn't achieve security, right? We were kind of making that same mistake in healthcare, right? So that's why it's one of the worst offenders to me. It's like, if I pay you $100,000, the question executive asks is, how far are you moving the needle? And it's really not that far. So why pay $100,000, right? That's what your executives most likely will ask you. Why am I paying this money if I'm really not going to get anywhere? Can I use whatever's free out there? And there's plenty of free content I'll show you, right? The other thing is the UCF. How many of you heard of UCF? Unified Compliance Framework. At first, it was really good. I really liked it because when security was in its infancy in terms of people talking about it, we only had a handful of frameworks. So today, there's a bunch of them. There's one for each industry. So whenever there's a framework created, a consortium is gathered, and then they put together the best guidelines, and then they said that's a framework. That takes time. That takes like a year, right? We're already behind the curve because attacks are happening live. It's happening right now. What this does is this combines all of those languages. Remember that chart that I showed you a couple back? It attempts to combine all of the security languages to come up with one language. So when you say security and I say protection, we have a new word that we agree on called defense, right? That's called harmonization of language, where we take two source languages and we create a new target language. We got too many sources right now. We got way too many sources to kind of keep up to update that language, right? That's problematic from your legal side. They're not, every time you read a contract, they redefine some of those terms all the time, right? So, so that's kind of, the state of the frameworks. We'll get to how do you actually, get past this, leveraging what the government has provided. I went on Human Health Services website, and for you guys who are doing high trust, I kind of looked at it. I was about to do a high trust certification until I got a pushback, high trust readiness, you can say, until I got a pushback from an executive. He said, all right, what is this certification going to get me? And I did the normal thing, your reputation, your culture, your security is going to be nice and tight, and you're not going to get attacked, or you will, but you'll catch it, and all these things that we normally try to use to sell the business, right? And then he says, okay, if I get certified and I go to court, does Human Health Services even recognize your certification or anybody else's certification? That's kind of where he got me, right? And again, I'm being very clear and honest with you guys, right? And their legal counsel sent me this. And of course, I didn't get the business, but it made me realize internally what's happening in our curriculum, right? we're selling something that may not deliver that much value, right? So this, it tells you, the Human Health Services basically says, is it required? And then the answer is no, right? So if it's not required, when you actually get to court, it doesn't really, it might add to the evidence, but they're still going to look at the Federal Register and weigh, assess you against that, rather than some certification out there, right? So, so all these issues, we kind of get to where do we start, right? My thought is that the business, the oldest out of all of the roles in the business is the CIO, right? Or the CEO. That's the oldest kind of position, right? And then the next came the financial guy who keeps tab on money, the CFO. Then came legal. Make me money and keep me legal, right? So start with the Federal Register. Structure your conversation around the business and how do you use the Federal Register to make a case. If you dig through it hard enough, if you email me, I can send you this stuff. But it refers to NIST. It tells you to follow NIST, right? So if you get in court, that's what they're going to look at, right? And then use only approved mapping. There's a lot of mappings out there from smart people. I've done them myself as a intellectual exercise. There's a ton of free mappings out there that are available to you. So first start with HIPAA. It directly maps to NIST cybersecurity framework. That was released sometimes this year, right? And then once you're a little bit more mature, use the HIPAA to NIST RMF. NIST RMF will actually give you down to technical details, right? So that's the second level of maturity. And then eventually you can use NIST to map to computer settings. The government has provided you how to map to a McAfee environment that's HIPAA compliant, right? And then kind of look to software to automate your processes. Don't rely on software to say, all right, give me a GRC tool and it'll work like that, right? Kind of go through this exercise with your department, right? So I got like 5 minutes. Here are the links. The presentation will be available somewhere. I should have put my email address, but come talk to me. I'll send you all of the links. The Federal Register is right there. The latest 2016 mappings are available from the U.S. government as well. And then, of course, the privacy overlay, which is really, really comprehensive. It's about a 200-page document. That's available as well, right? So that's kind of how we kind of get over the language problem. So, start the conversation with compliance, transition it to risk, and then use something approved for your frameworks, and then kind of go over to something automated. So that's kind of the presentation, and this is just a nice little, current state of affairs, how normally people are doing things. They start in an Excel sheet, then they go over to the voluntary, non-voluntary requirements, and then kind of, into spreadsheets and emails. Once you have this for your organization, that's when you can start looking at automation of a GRC system. Before that, you're going to buy something, you're going to be way too immature to understand it and implement it correctly to get your value out of it. Right? So that's it. Questions? Comments? All right. Thank you very much.